The date is June 10th, 1940, and this is the evening news. Yesterday, German forces crossed the Seine River, meeting little to no resistance. The number of mechanized armor and the speed at which they have progressed being too great for the defenders to overcome. Reports that are coming in say the French troops are withdrawing from... Wait, what? I'm sorry, dear listener, but this is just in. Prime Minister Benito Mussolini of Italy has just declared war on Britain and France.
Turn that off. It's
The
scaring
Italian
me.
Prime Minister has stated categorically
Yes, of course,
the
Peggy.
Axis powers and...
Hans, what are we going to do? Hitler's forces are already at our doorstep. Every way out of the city has been flooded by people. The trains are not running. Cars are packing the streets. Even the barges are overcrowded. I heard that even the government officials have fled with no plans to protect the city.
Peggy, remember, we have everything we need except a way out, yeah? We have our identity papers, our passports, visas, money, and each other. Let us go out in the morning and see what we can do about transportation before the city is overrun.
You're right, Hans. We have each other, and that is all we need. But do not forget our manuscripts too. I do not want to leave them behind. We have worked so very hard on them.
My love, as long as you are safe, I would not have it any other way. Hello, trippers. Welcome to another episode of the Road Tripping Podcast, where we strive to make your commute suck just a little less. We want to say thanks for tuning into the show and that we greatly appreciate you being here. This show provides us with the opportunity to share with you things that we find interesting and unusual in the hopes that we can both inspire and entertain you while you are forced to do the things you dread doing, like for us, sitting in traffic. Well, today we hope that you've brought your curiosity with you because we have an interesting show for you. As you can tell from the title and artwork of the show, in this episode we're going to be telling you the story of Hans and Margret Razorback, or as they became more commonly known to their fans around the world, Margret and Hans A. Ray, and how they brought to children everywhere the lovable and ever-curious character known as George.
Hans Augusta Rayersbach was born to Jewish parents in Hamburg, Germany, in September of 1898. As a young child, he found he had a talent for art, languages, he could speak nearly 7 fluently, and a love of animals that he would often incorporate into his works. As he grew up, he had the added benefit of having the Hagenbeck Tierpark Zoo only blocks from his home, where he enjoyed going, often drawing new inspirations for his art from the actions of animals on display. When World War I came along in 1916, now 18-year-old Hans was drafted into Kaiser Wilhelm's army and assigned to an infantry and medical corps unit. He hated the army, and he hated the war, but he did his duty and served for 3 years in both France and Russia. He even learned to speak a bit of Russian to add to his collection of languages. After the war, Hans struggled to make a living in Germany as the economy was in a slump due to Germany's loss. He did what he could to make money, even illustrating posters for the local circus as he attended the University of Hamburg and the University of Munich, studying philology, which is the study of languages and their sources, and natural sciences. This lasted until 1924, when Hans packed up his things and headed to Brazil by ship to work for a relative's import firm, selling of all things bathtubs. At least this afforded him the chance to learn Portuguese.
Margret Waldstein, 8 years Hans Jr., was also from Hamburg and was also from a Jewish family. Her father, Felix, was a member of the Reichstag, which was the German parliament, so she was afforded a bit more luxury than most, including attending the famous Bauhaus School of Art in Dusseldorf. She also studied at the University of Munich until 1928, when she took a job in advertising. In 1935, with the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazism's hatred of the Jewish people, Margret left Hamburg and traveled to Rio de Janeiro looking for work and adventure. She knew that a family friend and one that she admired, Hans of course, was living in Rio. The pair began to work together in an advertising business and grew close. In August 1935, they wed and moved into an apartment in Rio. Margret, like Hans, was a big animal lover, and they both had a fondness for monkeys. In their apartment, they shared their space with 2 pet marmosets, which, of course, are small monkeys. It was during this time in Rio that Margret and Hans decided that some changes needed to be made to their names. Margret, who preferred to be called Margret, though Hans liked to call her Peggy, and Hans, changed their last name to Ray because it was much easier for people to say and for their clients to remember.
A few months later, the Rays, now Brazilian citizens, decided to travel back to Europe as their honeymoon getaway and took the marmosets with them. Unfortunately, even though Margret knitted them sweaters, the Atlantic crossing was too cold for the animals and they did not survive the journey. After visiting several cities, Hans and Margret ended up in Paris. More importantly, in the famous artist's neighborhood of Montmartre, and they decided they would spend the next 2 weeks in the city. It did not take long for the couple to decide that the elegance and excitement they found in Paris was for them. So they took up residence in the Terrace Hotel, apartment 505, where they would spend the next 4 years of their lives.
I bet by now you're getting curious about when George comes into the picture, right? Now that we have set the background, we can get into the time frame when the Rays began writing and illustrating books for children. Hans had been contracted by a publisher to write a children's book, and the couple came up with Cicely G and the Nine Monkeys, also known as Raffi and the Nine Monkeys, of which Curious George makes his first appearance. However, another one of their manuscripts is of importance to our story, but you would not recognize it by its name as it was at the time it was written. Why, you say? Because it was called The Adventures of Fifi. That is right, Fifi, who was a curious little monkey that was always getting into trouble and then finding a way to get out of it. Sounds familiar, right? This was another iteration of the clever monkey theme that Hans came up with and intended it to be his next published work. In September of 1939, with World War II in its early stages, the couple traveled to Chateau Fouga in southern France. There, they set up their studio and continued working on their manuscripts and illustrations, enjoying the solitude of the countryside, which is a good thing because Fifi was soon needed to come to their rescue. You see, some of the locals who overheard the couple speaking French with a German accent took them for possible spies and called the village police. When the officer came to see them, Hans assured the officer there was a misunderstanding and led him up to the studio and showed him their work. The officer was convinced when he saw Fifi that the couple meant no harm and they were not spies, but merely artists. In 1940, Hans signed a contract with a publisher for Fifi and received an advance. This was very important to our story as it was this money that was used when they were ready to leave Paris, as you heard in the show's intro. At this point, Fifi was still not a published work. Which brings us up to the same time as that fateful day on June 10th, 1940, when the Nazis crossed the river and prepared to march on Paris.
The next day, June 11th, 1940, Hans and Margret Ray went out into the city to try to find a means to get away before the German army invaded the city of Paris where they were living. Since trains were not running and they did not have money for a car, they struggled with trying to find an alternative means of getting out of town. Eventually, they managed to find a small bicycle shop open, but all the owner had available was a tandem bicycle. Hans and Margret tried to practice riding the bicycle, but it was a disaster. A tandem bicycle would not do to get them out of the city. The Rays then returned the bicycle to the shop and bargained for parts off the shelf to build 2 bicycles, as well as purchase 4 large baskets and some spare parts. This cost them 1,600 francs, which were almost a month's worth of lodging as their residence, apartment 505 in the Terrace Hotel. While Hans worked at the shop to build the bicycles, Margret returned to their home and put together a small pile of their belongings to take with them. She was careful to pack their manuscripts and artwork into a satchel to ensure that they were not left behind. The couple began their flight out of the city the next day, June 12, 1940, on a wet and rainy day riding the newly constructed bicycles. With a little food and water, the clothes on their back, Hans' pipe, and their manuscripts, they joined thousands of other refugees leaving Paris. Hans was very meticulous, and he kept a journal of his life where he recorded everything. His notes indicated that the first day they rode 24 kilometers, or almost 15 miles to the town of Étampes, where they found a farmhouse willing to give them shelter. The next day, they rode another 26 kilometers, or just over 16 miles, where they found another shelter with another farmer. And finally, on the third day, they rode the remaining 32 kilometers, or nearly 20 miles, to the city of Orléans. In 3 days, the Rays had traveled a total trip of 51 miles south through the French countryside. They were tired, dirty, and exhausted, but they were not done yet. The plan from here was to catch a train to Portugal and then a ship across the Atlantic back to Brazil, as it was also a neutral party and they were officially citizens.
Fun fact. During World War II, the country of Portugal was technically a neutral party. However, they had close ties to the UK due to their military alliances. In fact, the alliance between Portugal and the UK, known as the Anglo-Portuguese Alliance, has been enforced due to politics since the Treaty of Windsor in 1386 and remains till this day, making it the oldest military alliance in recorded history.
The couple boarded a train to Bordeaux with their bicycles, and for the next 2 days and nights, they rode the hot and stuffy trains to the town of Bayonne, where they sent telegrams to London and Rio to let family know that they'd gotten out of Paris. Next, they had a bike down the coast to the town of Biarritz to visit the Portuguese consulate in the hopes of getting permission to travel across Spain and Portugal. Luckily, they managed to secure the visas required, because if they had not, they would have to remain in the occupied France for the duration of the war. The visas in hand, though, were still not enough to get them out of Europe. The Rays bicycled to the town of Hendaye on the French border and visited the Spanish consulate, where they managed to secure the stamps needed across the border. Now extremely low on funds and not needing them anymore, the bicycles were sold to the customs official for 650 francs, and the couple boarded the train for Lisbon.
The train was very crowded, and with people fleeing France, the officials on the train were wary of spies fleeing the country. Hans was targeted by an official for his paperwork, then asked about his line of work. It was here where Fifi would come to save the day again. Once the official saw the book, he smiled and returned the couple's paperwork and left them to their journey. And it was a long one, though not the longest they would make. The Rays spent 9 days on board the train before they finally crossed into Portugal. They were safe in neutral territory, and they could begin to relax, though now they were too broke to get passage across the Atlantic. So they contacted their bank in Rio to wire them funding, and once it arrived, bought tickets and sailed for Rio, but only as a stepping stone to their new home in America. On October 14th, 1940, the Rays and Fifi had finally made it to New York Harbor to start their American journey. 1 year later, their first book would be published in America by Houghton Mifflin, but it wasn't as Fifi. No, they changed it to be more Americanized, and thus, Curious George as we know him today was given to the world to enjoy.
Curious George books have been loved by children and adults for many, many years now, and it's not really because the text is so incredible, or the illustrations move you in an outstanding way. People seem to love Curious George because of the predictability of his unpredictable nature. Hans and Margret wrote 6 more books about George, with Hans mostly doing the illustrating and Margret the stories. But in later years, it was spun off into television shows and a major motion picture. Over the last 60 years, these books have captured the hearts and minds of readers throughout the world. All of the Curious George books, including the 7 original stories by Margret and Hans, have sold more than 25 million copies. They are so popular that his original story has never been out of print and has been translated into 25 languages. There are 2 burning questions that most people have about Curious George, and we would be amiss if we did not address them. 1. What is he, an ape or a monkey? And 2. What about the man in the yellow hat? As for the first, George is called a monkey in the books and not an ape, which is confusing because George, like all apes, has no tail like monkeys. That is because George is a particular kind of monkey. George is a Barbary macaque, which is the only species of macaque found outside of Asia and the only primate species found north of the Sahara in Africa. They typically range in color from yellowish gray to brown, like George, stand 55 to 70 centimeters or 20 to 27 inches, and weigh around 15 kilograms or 33 pounds. These little guys can live up to 30 years and are very social creatures. Sadly, their habitat is under threat and they are currently on the endangered species list. This is because too often the babies are captured and taken to Morocco or Europe, where you can see them chained up and used for tourist photo ops, which is known as the photo op trade, and is the main cause they are on the endangered list. If you want to learn more about the Barbary macaque and possibly donate to their cause of stopping this practice, be sure to go to barbarymacaque.org and check out their Just Say No campaign.
The man with the yellow hat, at least in the original tales, was known only as the man in the yellow hat, the man, or as your friend. The your friend moniker is strange because the man with the yellow hat is shown to have monkey-napped George to be taken, or possibly sold, to a zoo in the city, which, based on some of the artwork, could easily be in San Francisco. This was changed by others later to show George following the man onto the ship instead of being taken. After many adventures and time living in the zoo, Hans and Margret moved George out of the zoo and into living in the penthouse apartment with the man in the yellow hat. For 60 years, we were wondering what this guy's name was. I remember asking my parents when I was young, too. It was not until the Curious George movie of 2006 that he was referred to by another name. In the movie, he is referred to as Ted. But only if you saw the deleted scenes did you find out that the writers had given him the last name of Shackelford. This was, of course, after both Hans and Margret had died. Hans in 1977, 3 weeks short of his 79th birthday, and Margret, who lived another 19 years in 1996, at the age of 90. During that time, she was a staunch promoter and protector of their work, even establishing the Curious George Foundation in 1989 to fund children's programs for children who share George's qualities of ingenuity, opportunity, determination, and curiosity in learning and exploring. She wanted George to remain a figure that children could look up to, so she never let anyone use George without her involvement in any project. She even sued and won against a Canadian company that funded some of the cartoons because they allowed third parties to distribute VHS tapes without permission.
Curious George will soon be with us for 80 years and will most likely be with us for more than another 80 due to his lovable nature and innocent curiosity. I know I look forward to reading it with my grandchildren someday. If you've enjoyed today's show, there are many websites online where you can find bits and pieces of the story. But we found The Journey That Saved Curious George, The True War Time Escape of Margret and H.A. Ray by Louise Borden to be especially complete.
Hey Trippers, do you like wrestling? Then check out this cross-promotion with the 1130 podcast and your host, Dre on Wheels. You can find the show on YouTube and Apple Podcasts.
What's going on, everybody? This your man Dre, aka Dre on the Wheels, and I'm the host of DC's newest, hottest podcast. Yeah, it's the 1130 podcast on YouTube. Go subscribe, man. Tell somebody.
Well, that is all the time we have for in this episode of the Road Tripping Podcast. But if you liked it and want to hear more, please subscribe to the show feed and give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast directory. The more positive reviews we receive, the more trippers will be able to find us, and the faster we will grow, thus able to bring you new content. Be sure to visit our website, theroadtrippingpodcast.com, to keep updated on future shows, leave show suggestions, and see all the ways to find and interact with us all in one place. If you're able and are feeling generous, then a link to our Patreon can be found under the support link on the homepage. As always, until next we meet, stay safe, trippers.